Well, what are events? I mean, are events things in the world? Does the world come packaged in events? Actually, it doesn't. Events are our mental constructions imposed on whatever's going on. So events are really internal. And we know that to try to count the number of events that's going on is kind of meaningless. So there are about as many events as you decide to impose. Again, another form of syntax. So how do we get beyond syntax? We have to look at the notion of reference. Truth will depend on reference. We start naturally by looking at the words that purport to refer. Say London is taken to be a prototypical, a referential word. But is London a thing in the outside world? I can tell you that I visited London before it was burned down and rebuilt 20 miles up the Thames. So is there an object in the real world which is physical because it can be burned down, but then can be rebuilt somewhere else with different physical objects and looking differently? Is there such an object in the physical world, in the outside, in the material world? Certainly not. We could decide to rebuild Carthage, let's say. It was gone a couple thousand years ago. We could rebuild it somewhere else, look different, but it could be Carthage. So whatever these things are, they're not names of things in the outside world. What about other words? Are there, in fact, we might rest the question whether there are any words in language at all that refer to anything in the outside world. I think the answer is there aren't. Aristotle asked the question, what is a house? A house consists of the amalgam of two different kinds of elements. In his metaphysics, they're matter and form. So the matter of the house is the timbers, the bricks, the stuff it was made of. The form of the house is the design, what it's for, what the architect had in mind, how it's used, and so on. So something might look physically just like a house, but in fact be something totally different. It could be a library, could be a garage, could be a paperweight for a giant, could be all kinds of things. It depends on what the architect had in mind and how it's used and what it's for, basically. But the properties of form are not in the physical world. They're in the mental world. When Aristotle talked about this, this is, from his point of view, metaphysics. In fact, it's in his book, Metaphysics. But when you go to the 17th century again, there was a kind of a cognitive revolution, and a lot of these ideas were reinterpreted in terms of modes of cognition, which I think is the right way to look at them. So reinterpreting it in those terms, a house is something that we construct in our minds, which has a material element, but of course the crucial part of it is what Aristotle called the form. That's something that's part of our mental operations. So when we use the word house, we're carrying out the act of referring, like I'm referring to that object over there, but the word house is not referring. Okay. You think about every word in the language, it's exactly the same way. There's an example even earlier than Aristotle, pre-Socratic example used by Heraclitus, who argued that you can't cross the same river twice, because when you cross it the second time, it's a completely different physical object, and you're a different physical object. So it's impossible to cross the same river twice. Of course, we do cross the same river twice, which simply tells us that our notion of river does not refer to anything in the material world. It refers to a construction that we developed. And if you start playing around with how do you individuate these objects, it becomes pretty tricky. So, for example, take river again. Say the Charles River, which I used to cross on the way to work up and back every day in Boston. Suppose you take the Charles River and you reverse the course of the water. It goes the opposite direction. Okay, you've still the Charles River. Suppose you divert it into a different direction, because you don't want it to go into the bay, but somewhere else. Still the Charles River. In fact, you can play around with it and make all sorts of massive changes in the physical object. It will still be the Charles River. On the other hand, there are trivial changes that will prevent it from being a river at all. So suppose you put barriers along the side, and you start using it for, say, commercial tankers going up and down. And now it's between 2 points. Then it's a canal. It's not a river anymore. Suppose you even make a more minuscule change. You make what in physics is called a phase change, from the liquid to the glassy state. Tiny change, almost undetectable without instruments. But now it has a hard surface. And you paint a line down the middle, and you start using it to commute to Boston. Okay, now it's a highway. You've made an almost undetectable change. If you play around with it some more, you can see that you can make huge changes in the physical object. It stays the Charles River. You can make virtually undetectable changes. It's not a river at all. Take a look at any other word in the language, you find it's pretty much the same. So it may be that language simply does not have the concept of truth and reference at all, which means it doesn't have semantics. There is no semantics. There's syntax, and there's modes of using the objects you've constructed, roughly what's called pragmatics. It could turn out that the whole study of language reduces to syntax and pragmatics, with syntax having these many different variants. In fact, my guess is that's probably what we're going to find when we pursue the topic further. That raises many very interesting questions. So, for example, take these terms like house or river, London, whatever you like. Where do they come from? If we look at animal symbolic systems, a very striking feature of them is that the atoms of these systems, the elements within them, do in fact pick out identifiable physical events. Okay, so you take the bee that's a honey bee and does the right sorts of things, then it's it does the famous waggle dance. It flies out to a flower, comes back to the hive, waggles, and the things that it's doing are one-to-one identified with particular physical phenomena extraneous to the bee. The distance to the flower, the height of the flower, the orientation in which you have to fly, the quality of the flower, and so on. Every animal system we know is like that. Monkey calls, for example, if there's something we call a warning call, what it means is the leaves are fluttering in a certain way. The monkey reflexively emits some noise. Other monkeys run away. Maybe an eagle's coming, something like that. Animal systems seem to be like this completely. The human systems are not like this at all. That raises a very interesting question. Another one of those mysteries. this come from? And if you look at the array of mysterious things, there are plenty of them, and they fall into a couple of categories, two categories. One category is the category of mysteries where we just can't get the right kind of evidence because it's just empirically impossible for us to do it. We can't go back, say, 200,000 years and hear what people were saying. In principle, yeah, it's an empirically possible. It's a theoretically possible task, but you just can't do it. That's one kind of mystery. But then there's the deeper kinds of mysteries, which have to do with things like selecting the sequence given by the Hilbert epsilon operator when you're trying to form a coordination, or more generally just picking what sentence you're going to produce. And these kinds of mysteries are the kind where you really don't even have bad ideas. There's no idea as to how to proceed. Those, we could ask what that category of mysteries is like. Could mean it's some restriction on human cognitive capacities. A lot of debate about this. Most scientists vigorously reject the idea that there could be a limit on cognitive capacities. But if you think about it, it's a strange position. If humans are similar or part of the organic world, not, say, angels, we ought to have the same properties as other kinds of organisms in some respects. Every organism we know has scope of cognitive capacity and limits of cognitive capacity. And in fact, the two are kind of logically related. Whatever is yielding the scope is also imposing certain limits. And you might ask why humans should be exempt from this. I'll leave that with you as another problem.
So I hope the former phonologists and semanticists in the audience who are now syntacticians will have questions. May the questions begin. Yes.